All you.
What's going on?
Well,
Hello? Hello?
yeah, you
Yeah, I'm
good?
here.
What happened there?
Jesus Christ. Okay. What's going on, guys? Welcome to the shop. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast. My name is Eitan Mosier. His name is Sam Lane. You can find me on Twitter at AtonAlive. You can find Sam at FF Stompy. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by two of the best in the video fantasy space. Guys that have been doing this a long time and have one of the best shows out there going for two. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jeff Lambert and Ryan Serfas.
Hey guys,
What's up,
thanks for having us on.
What's up, guys? Yeah, thanks for having us on, man. This will be a lot of fun.
We talked. I think both of us talked earlier this week.
Yeah,
We're becoming quickly becoming best friends. So welcome, friends.
all right. Thursday and Tuesday, you guys are on.
Yep.
That's what the rookie draft does to us. It brings us all together, especially now when nobody has anything else to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like everybody's just podcasting with everybody now. It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, I mean, all we needed is a global pandemic to bring the world together. So I like how this has gone so far.
That was the plan all along, right?
Definitely it's a plan. I love it. All right, so we have just a number of things to get into today. I mean, we haven't even finished talking about the rookie class as a whole. If you guys listened to the last episode, we got some names in there, but there's so many of them that we could not possibly fit them all in one. So we're going to get into more rookie stuff in just a moment. But before we do, I actually wanted to ask you guys, tell us about Going for Two. Tell us how it started and how you guys eventually started to do the video show that you guys do. Just give us a little bit of a story of what led you guys to where you are today.
All right. Well, it started for me way back in 2015. I was always the guy in my group of friends where people would text me on Sundays and ask who to start, who to sit. They'd text me on Tuesday nights, who they pick up at the waiver wire. And then at one point, a friend of mine said, "Hey, man, you just start a blog or something, because every time I text you, you have good advice." I was like, "All right, cool. Let me do that." So I literally went to Google and said, "How do you start a blog?" And that's where it started. For the first about 6 to 8 months, it was just me, just writing, whatever I could. Eventually, I kind of started growing a little bit. We got into some baseball. We got into some basketball. And before I knew it, I had 40 writers on staff, and the site is, doing really well. It was 2016. I decided to get into the podcasting business, sort of happenstance. It's kind of when I never thought I would do a podcast. And I kind of got in with this a friend of mine I met through Twitter, and he kind of got me on his show for the first time, my first podcast. And then once the show was done, he asked if he can syndicate his show on my website. I was like, sure. In exchange, he let me use his podcast service to do my podcast. And that's where I first started just rolling solo, which is the hardest thing to do. I can't do solo anymore. Before long, I wanted to do it full time. So I got my own service and, started having guests come on and buying my equipment. And then I had Ryan on as a guest one day. He ran a Facebook group called Fancy Football Connect. I had him and another Facebook group kind of come on and kind of do like a Facebook battle. He was kind of like debate some players. And then before I knew it, Ryan was a regular guest on the show. And then at one point he texted me like, "Hey man, are you looking for a co-host?" And I had never even thought about it before, because I thought no one wants to do this, all the time with me and spend an hour with me talking the whole time. But Ryan wanted to do it for some reason. So we started it up, and it's been going strong ever since.
Jeff couldn't get rid of me.
Yeah, I couldn't get rid of him. I tried. It can't happen.
Sometimes that's how you make it in this space. You just kind of force yourself onto shows.
Yeah, I was with 24/7 on their podcast before, and a couple other sites before that. It was with Dominate. I was with Dynasty Dorks, and then ended up here Going for Two.
Yeah, man, it's kind of one of those industries where you bounce around, you meet a lot of people, and then you kind of figure out exactly what you like to do best, whether that's writing, whether it's podcasting, blogging. There's so many outlets in the fantasy space that it's grown to the point that, I mean, if you find some pathway that you want to take, chances are you don't even have to start from scratch. Somebody's already done it before, and you can kind of get an idea of what types of things you want to draw from their shows to put into yours.
Definitely.
All right, so as promised, we're going to get into some of the rookie talk. And I think one of the biggest questions that we didn't really go too deeply into the last go around on this show was Keyshawn Vaughn. I mean, this guy is going to be behind, at least as far as we know today, Ronald Jones. But he lands in one of the best situations that you could have possibly imagined in a Bruce Arians offense with Tom Brady, with all those weapons around him, and potentially with a clear role. So do we think that Keyshawn Vaughn is truly worth the first-round tender that he's now being given in dynasty leagues and rookie drafts, or are we a little bit guilty of swinging too far to one side of this pendulum, as we tend to do as a whole in the dynasty community? There seems to be no middle ground with some players. Either we're all in it or all out. So what are you guys when it comes to Vaughn?
Ryan, you can go first.
I mean, he's in that very last spot of the first. They're like right in the very end for me. There's a lot of guys on the cusp. I think it's a lot with my team build. I'm not fully on board. I like some of his profile, what he can do, but other parts, not as much. I don't think he's ever going to be an RB1, but I think he's going to be somebody who could possibly give you RB2 potential and a nice floor.
I think his receiving skills, and I've heard them sort of say that this is going to be the James White of this offense, and I don't know if that's going to be true or not, because I don't think his receiving skills are quite on the level of James White. I think he'll be a good check down kind of running back, but he won't be a guy that's running routes. But with that said, Rojo has the worst hands, so anything is better than him. So Tom Brady checking down to Keyshawn Vaughn will kind of give him a solid floor. And I think in this offense, the only thing I'm really worried about is going to be his pass protection. Because as we all know, if you get Tom Brady blown up, you're not seeing the field again for a while. So as long as he can come in and learn the pass protection schemes and get those check down passes, and that offense is going to be explosive. I mean, you already got some, you got Chris Godwin there, you got Mike Evans, you got OJ Howard, you got Gronkowski's there. So Keyshawn Vaughn is like, fifth or sixth on the pecking order, but if they are explosive, if we think they are, I think there's going to be plenty of stuff to go around for him as well.
I mean, they hit it pretty hard here, right? Like Jeff said, he's not going to be James White, but he's going to be the pass catching back on a team that, or with a quarterback that is known to check down to his running backs, and with a head coach who has used those pass catching backs in his passes, specifically with Arizona and David Johnson. So, I mean, he could be I think his ceiling is RB3 right now. Unless he somehow overtakes Rojo, he's going to be just a pass catching back. You're not going to see much on the ground from him.
Keyshawn Vaughn, the cast patching back, folks. That's what he is today. But I mean, yeah, I think that you guys did definitely get it. I don't know why the Dynasty community has seemingly kind of gone all in on this guy. I think it's just a hatred of Rojo from those guys who first didn't believe in him when he came into the league when he was a rookie. At this point, we already expect this team to be pass focused because of Bruce Arians' history, because Tom Brady's bought to the team with what the team already has in terms of weapons. I don't think Dara Gubwale has gone anywhere, so he's even a threat to take some of that receiving workload if Keyshawn doesn't fire immediately. And then on top of that, I just don't see how Rojo completely goes away in this, because the best attribute of Keyshawn Vaughn is probably pass catching and not necessarily rushing between the tackles. I'm not necessarily saying that Rojo is so much better at him than that, but we haven't seen any backs really do all that well behind this Tampa Bay offensive line in a while. Just last year, their adjusted line yards we're among the bottom fourth of the league. So there's a lot that stands in the way of this guy being a true 3-down back, if that's even an outcome that you could possibly imagine at this point. But I think that the fervor around him has just grown a little bit too much, and people need to start to calm themselves down when it comes to looking at Vaughn, because a lot of things have to hit for it to go right. I think people just take the player profile or Dalvin Cook comparison and immediately think that he's good enough to take that role. And I think there's a lot standing in front of him that wasn't necessarily standing in front of Dalvin Cook at the time, especially when it had to pertain to injuries in his own backfield that allowed him to start that year. So I like the prospect. I just don't necessarily know if the prospect is going to be the guy that we all want him to be in fantasy this year. And as we know with running backs, every year thereafter, your job is in danger. So if you don't fire quickly, you flame out really, really quick. And this just might be a situation where that happens for a guy that doesn't really have a legitimate role on the team as we speak right now. So let's go into one of the questions that I kind of like to ask some of the guests that we've had on after the draft. For me, landing spot is the all-important thing. Honestly, can't evaluate a rookie's outlook without taking into account the landing spot, because they're not going to necessarily have every opportunity to succeed in every place in the NFL. Not every coach is going to be creative enough to use certain players. So is there a guy that maybe you go against the grain with? Ryan, we'll start with you. When it comes to dynasty leagues that people seem to really kind of be holding in high regard, but you have some worries about moving forward?
I was going to say Laviska Shenault's a guy I'm a little bit more worried about. The skill set's there. Everybody loves him, not even including the injury concerns. He's kind of been a trick type player where he's used as a running back, used as a receiver. It kind of gives me those Cordell Patterson vibes with how he's going to be used. And that's just not something that's really fantasy viable in my eyes. It really worries me. I love the upside he has, but I don't think he's going to be the team's number one receiver, and I don't think that he's going to be used the way we think he is.
Eitan, were you going to moderate here or what?
I thought I was just going to go to Jeff after that. Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry. Yeah, so the guy that I'm kind of looking at, and I put out my top 12 on Instagram and on Facebook just recently, and my top 12 running backs didn't include A.J. Dillon, and I got some flack for that. And I think he's the one I'm kind of down on. I think, one, landing spot wasn't great. Obviously, Aaron Jones is there. They got Williams there as well. Someone did point out to me that they're both going into their last year of their contract and both be free agents next year if the Packers don't sign them, obviously. So you could see A.J. Dillon maybe in 2021 being a thing. But the thing that gets me is the comp that they was kind of giving him before the draft was Derrick Henry. And A.J. Dillon is not Derrick Henry. He's not as big as Derrick Henry. He can't catch passes like Derrick Henry. That's the only thing you can probably say that's the same as Derrick Henry. Other than that, he's not Derrick Henry. He won't be Derrick Henry. He won't catch passes. So I think that's one guy that I'm really down on, especially for 2020 and even going forward if they do, move on from Aaron Jones and from Williams, and it is Dillon's backfield. I don't know if I want that in fantasy. I think for NFL purposes, he'll be a good back. He'll be a solid back. But for us, we want that PPR upside. He's just not going to give it to me.
I mean, this is one that I think is probably the most divisive guy in this class, and that's Zach Moss. I didn't like him wherever he landed, but now we know he's going to share. I mean, it's going to be a true probably running back by committee. I could see Singletary taking more touches, but his upside is extremely limited. He's not a pass catcher. Though he did catch passes in college. He's not the best pass catcher. But he just looks slow is the issue for me. And we saw, and I don't know if you guys are David Montgomery truthers or not, but we saw that David Montgomery was slow in his rookie season. I'm not saying that he can't get better, that was just something that I was and many were seeing coming in, looking at the film, was his speed isn't there. And I don't know if Zach Moss's game really translates that well to the NFL because of that speed.
Yeah, I like that comp that you gave with David Montgomery, because I think both players were, as far as elusive rating, were very high in elusive rating in college. And we just assumed that they would be just as elusive in the NFL, which they probably are, but they're not explosive enough and fast enough to do anything. I mean, you break tackles and get 1 extra yard, that can do a whole lot for you. And that's where I think that both those players are kind of struggling a little bit. Yes, they're shifty. Yes, they can break tackles, but they lack that speed and explosiveness to sort of take it to the next level.
Exactly.
Yeah, AJ Dillon and Zach Moss both find themselves in situations where they have a lot of competition immediately from the time that they step on the field. In AJ Dillon's case, it's not only competition, but it's competition of a direct comparable in Williams, somebody who kind of is the same type of runner and same type of running back that AJ Dillon is. At least you can offer that. Well, if Aaron Jones gets the receiving work, then at least the rushing work is out there for somebody. But I think that the presence of a third guy in that backfield even makes it a little bit more of a question mark as to whether or not he'll fire quickly enough to not then be replaced himself if the Green Bay Packers are intent on continuing to add to that backfield. We're assuming that they go away from both Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams, but they can also go away from one of them, or they could potentially choose to go away from both of them and then draft another running back in that draft to then go ahead and be that 1-2 combo with AJ Dillon. So I think it's a while that you're waiting for until you see steady production from him. And when it comes to Zach Moss, a lot of things that people had problems with Devin Singletary in terms of his perceived lack of athleticism, you have the same thing with Zach Moss. So I just don't know what the split is in terms of what these guys are able to do. If you're going to say just because of size purposes that maybe Zach Moss is chosen by the offensive coordinator and by the coach out there in Buffalo to be the goal line back, then you would assume that Devin Singletary is going to get all of the receiving work. So that in itself really lowers both of their perceived value in year one. In terms of Laviska Shenault, I don't know if I'm maybe on the other side of this. Maybe a couple of you guys that haven't chimed in on this one can after I do as well. But I see Laviska Shenault as landed in a pretty decent situation. There's not much competition out there for targets outside of DJ Chark in the same way that Jamal Williams and Aaron Jones are out of contract in a year. Dede Westbrook is out of contract in a year as well. And there really isn't that much depth on the Jaguars chart at wide receivers. So I think that Laviska Shenault is going to have every ability to be at least a type of yak gadget player that is going to be able to take some screens for them and take some of the receiving workload from Leonard Fournette that they probably didn't really want to use in that capacity again after last year's performance. So do you guys have maybe an ulterior view on what could potentially happen to Laviska Shenault going into this season?
I think that Laviska Shenault scares me for one reason, not really because of his athletic ability, but because of the injuries. I think he's had injuries going back even to high school. We had Ethan Turner on our show a couple of weeks ago, and he was pointing out some of the things that sort of scare him going forward. And that's the only thing holding me back. I do think that if we were to just take health out of the equation, just look at his athletic ability and what he can do in the offense, I think he will be a good fit there. But injuries is what scares me and knocks him down a little bit for me.
I wanted to add something with the two backs real quick. With Zach Moss, we're talking about that red zone threat. They use Josh Allen so heavily there, and that's going to be his biggest competition in the red zone. It's not going to be Singletary. And all reality, even as good as he is in the short yardage situations, Josh Allen's a monster running the ball up the middle. And I think he's still going to have a hard time getting consistent touchdown production with that there, plus having the receiving taken away like we spoke about. And then with A.J. Dillon, the real reason everybody knows that Jamal Williams still has playing time is because he's a phenomenal pass blocker, which is nothing for us in fantasy. except for takes guys off the field who are better runners and could be better runners. And I think that's what's going to hurt Dylan short term.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those.
I mean, in terms of Chenault, for me, I guess I view him as like a Debo type to this offense, which I think can be a top 24 wide receiver sometime in the near future. Maybe not this year, but I would say in year 1, 2, or 3, he could become that Debo type, that top 24 type. I don't know, like if his ceiling's all that high, unless they use him like a Tyreek Hill. But I mean, with his skill set, I have to believe they want to get the ball in his hands at some point.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's kind of copying him to Cordell Patterson, except if Cordell Patterson could actually play wide receiver. And I think that, what Jeff said about the injuries is probably the number one thing that's holding me back fully when it comes to him. But situation-wise, and in terms of what is available on that offense, when you take the deep threat away, the guy to kind of work the underneath, work the middle of the field, they don't really have a tight end of note as well. So, I think he can definitely do it sooner rather than later. Now, this is a dynasty show, all in all, when it comes down to it. So we like to talk about more than just individual players on the podcast. We tend to spend some time working the brains of everybody that we have on this show in terms of asking them what their go-to dynasty strategy is. Mine is generally a wide receiver build that kind of looks to maintain flexibility long term and just not get myself in a situation where 2 years from now, maybe I had some bad luck with injuries and my team is now too old to compete. Stompies is generally running back heavy and looking to kind of win today. And both of those are viable strategies. Do you guys tend to side one over the other, or do you take both into account in maybe different league formats depending on what you kind of have to work with in terms of draft position?
I'd say I'm a best player available person, especially if we do with how early drafts have been in more recent years. I've been drafting whoever I can get and then using that to move and adjust my team trade-wise, what needs to be. I'd probably lean a little bit heavier receiver as of late, unless I can get one of the truly elite guys who I think can last a little bit longer, whose game's a little bit different, like a Christian McCaffrey or Barkley, who's more receiving-based running back, because I feel like they have a better chance of holding up. But in the majority of cases, it's going to be fairly receiver-heavy to start, unless I'm at that very tip top of the draft.
Yeah, I agree with that. I usually go receiver heavy as well. And I do that because I plan to draft running backs going forward in rookie drafts. I did this in my main dynasty league where, I think it was 5 years ago we did our startup drafts, and I got Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, and Allen Robinson, who, even to this day are still viable receivers. And it allowed me to just concentrate on running backs. And I ended up getting Christian McCaffrey and Nick Chubb. So I've kind of got my running backs now where, I kind of passed on them in the startup. I think I ended up with Mark Ingram and CJ Anderson at the time. Ended up trading both of those guys away to get, some more picks, and then end up getting my running backs. And now my team's pretty solid. So those receivers, because their career is so long, you can draft them young, and get them started, and you have them for, 6, 7, 8 years, and you can use your rookie drafts to get your running backs.
Do you guys ever find yourselves in a situation where you kind of forfeit that first year, not really looking to win and focus more on potentially trading down to acquire draft picks and just top 50 players wherever you can? Or are you looking for a certain tier of players and picking pretty close to that and really only going after rookies if it comes down to it?
I think I've tried both, and I think you can manage to do both that way. I prefer having the opportunity to win a little bit more in the beginning, so I can kind of fund my playing to take those chances. And the way trading is now, I think you can always get picks, but there's nothing wrong with doing that and just going completely young. But I think a lot of it's how your draft goes, especially if you end up picking later. And you have a couple more chances to take on the board and you want to swing for the fences, I'm completely okay with that and building for the future. But I think it's where you're drafting. It's a lot of how it goes early on with if you're going to punt on that first year or not.
Yeah, for me, I have a hard time with the word tank, even in fantasy. I like to compete regardless. If I'm going to play fantasy, I want to win. So, I may play the long game, like I mentioned with my receivers, but I'm still competing. I'm not going to say, I'm just going to tank this year and I'm going to get, a couple first next year and a couple first year after that. I have a hard time doing that. It's just my competitive nature. I want to win. Even if my team is terrible, I still want to find a way to win. I want to find that waiver wire guy that no one thought about. I want to find that undrafted free agent that was left there. I want to find somebody that can help my team win. Even if my team is terrible, I'm going to find something to sell. They sell a piece off to get some more pieces to kind of help me, balance my roster out. But I have a hard time losing on purpose.
All right, so let's now take this opportunity to get into what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into our 5-point inspection, and let's start with a receiver that has many mixed opinions on him out there. Michael Pittman seemingly landed in a pretty good situation in Indianapolis. There is not very much competition for him. Doris Fontaine, Deion Kane, both those guys have been injured for the first couple of seasons in the NFL. They still have T.Y. Hilton. He's been in and out of the lineup. The guy that they drafted last year, Paris Campbell, is kind of the same type of receiver in terms of, at least so far in his career, having to deal with some injury issues and not necessarily being a big guy himself. Michael Pittman is completely the opposite of that. He is a huge receiver. He is more in the mold of a Dante Moncrief that they had previously, perhaps without maybe the same level of explosiveness, although he is plenty fast himself. The issue for me is that Phillip Rivers in the last couple of years has not thrown that much. He actually has not had a huge amount of volume when it comes to total pass attempts. The common notion around Phillip Rivers as well is that he doesn't necessarily throw deep as often as you would expect. We've seen Mike Williams in his offense over the last couple of seasons, be used for touchdowns, but not necessarily used all that much after that. He was kind of used in a deep threat type of role as opposed to even a red zone type. There is a true lack of other options out there in Indianapolis, though. Do you guys think that Michael Pittman is going to be the beneficiary of just a void in terms of what they're going to have to put up there just to stay competitive this year? Or do we think that this is going to be a situation where maybe we see a rookie receiver step into a lot of volume, but not necessarily be able to handle it as quickly as you would expect? Because in Michael Pittman's case, at least, it did take him several seasons in college to kind of catch up to the level of competition that he was facing. Can we see that same type of thing happen in the NFL?
I think going to what you said about Phillip Rivers not passing as much kind of goes to the offensive line there that they had in L.A. It's hard to pass when you're laying on your back most of the time. It seems like he was always under pressure, always kind of running for his life, and he isn't exactly a mobile quarterback. So that kind of hurt their passing offense a little bit. Coming to the Colts now, he has one of the best, if not the best, offensive line to work behind. So he's actually going to have some time to look down the field. And there's one thing about Pittman Jr. that I really like, and you kind of talked about it a little bit there in the open, is you can't teach 6'4". You know what I mean? He's a big guy, big target, and we've seen in the past where Rivers, has those big targets like the Antonio Gates that he had for so long, where he looked at those guys in the red zone. Mike Williams 2 years ago was a touchdown machine with Phillip Rivers. So I think Pittman Jr. can fit into the offense pretty well. I think we all kind of go of the mind that opportunity trumps talent. You can't really score points. No matter how talented you are, sitting on the bench, you can't score points. And I think Pittman Jr., because there's no competition there, he's going to get all the opportunity in the world to succeed there. And I think that he's going to be one of the guys that I'm looking at the bottom of the first round, I think, in my dynasty drafts.
Do you guys think that Indianapolis's total pass attempts per game will come up from 32.1 last season, which was 25th in the league, because of the presence of Phillip Rivers? Or do you think they're trading up to go ahead and draft Jonathan Taylor, already having Marlon Mack in the backfield, and that offensive line you just mentioned mean that maybe this is a team that kind of understands what they got, understands how they're trying to build it, and want to be a more run-focused offense than they have been, and can even potentially even drop from 25th in the league in terms of total pass attempts.
I'd say it's probably improve a little bit, just for the fact I think the drives are going to be a little bit longer sustained. They're not going to have – they're going to be able to play it a little bit – they're going to be throwing a little bit more just because Phillip Rivers is more trustworthy than Brissett was. Yes, they have the great running – they have the possibly great running back now, but that means they're going to convert more third downs or get more opportunities to throw. And I think they get a very specific role that helps Pittman, especially when it comes to the red zone work with that offense and Rivers there. But I think it will go up because their offense is definitely improved on all aspects. And even if they keep that same ratio, they should have more plays per game, and it should help them there.
I would say that offense did get better, like Ryan said. So the plays per game should go up. The scoring should go up. So while I don't know if they necessarily throw more in terms of ratio, pass to run, they, like Ryan said, could very easily have more pass attempts. In terms of Pittman, I mean, I always try and look for the unique wide receiver on a depth chart, because generally they're going to get an opportunity because they're not like the other wide receivers. Michael Pittman being a prime example of that, where Paris Campbell and T.Y. Hilton are smaller, speedier wide receivers. Pittman is a prototypical possession wide receiver who can jump up and get those 50-50 balls, which coincidentally, Phillip Rivers threw the sixth most deep pass attempts last season. So he's not afraid of throwing deep. He's just not good at it. His arm strength isn't there anymore, Phillip Rivers. So it'll be interesting to see how that works, because I like him because of his uniqueness on an Indy, and he could be a red zone threat. I don't know if I love him if they're going to do a lot more of the short, quick pass game.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see exactly how they choose to have their team run, just in terms of what they have available on offense that they didn't have last year. Last year, they were down to literally the last man at times at wide receiver. This year, if all these guys come back healthy, then there's obviously a lot more to have. And Phillip Rivers, if anything else, I don't even necessarily know if he's an upgrade to Jacoby Brissett, but I mean, some people say he could be, so I can see that happening. I would just say that there's been really no clear type of, I guess, way to pin this offense in terms of what they do pace-wise. Over the last couple of seasons, 2 years ago, the Indianapolis Colts were the second fastest team in the league when it came to situation-neutral play, when the score, I believe, was within 7 points. But last year, they were one of the slowest teams when it came to situation neutral pace. They wanted to run the games out, and they have heavily invested in running the ball this year. So I do think that this will be a better team. Maybe Michael Pittman has a red zone ability that nobody else there has, not just because of the lack of wide receivers, but because only Jack Doyle is there at tight end. There's not another body that's really going to be big enough to contend in those situations. So we could potentially see some touchdowns from Pittman, maybe in the same way that we saw some touchdowns from Williams early on. I just don't know if we're going to see volume outside of that. He might be one of those guys where you're happy to start him in the games when he scores, but if not, he caught 3 passes for 30 yards. So it'd be interesting to see what happens to Michael Pittman this year. But let's move on. Let's go on to some of the other, I guess you can call it big news at this point. I don't really know if you can ever call Chris Thompson big news, but Chris Thompson is the news. Jacksonville Jaguars recently signed Chris Thompson. We just talked about Laviska Shenault and his ability to work underneath, be that yak receiver for Gardner Minshew out in Jacksonville as well. That severely limits the number of targets that Leonard Fournette can expect to see this year. And the same thing can be said of Josh Jacobs. Lynn Bowden in that offense, classified as a running back, would say that, well, maybe even some carries are coming away from Jacobs. Definitely some targets are coming away from Jacobs when you couple his signing with the his drafting with the signing of Rashard in that offense as well. So are both of these running backs that were probably within, let's say, RB 12 to 8 range, do we think that that is the absolute ceiling for them again this year? Or do we think that maybe we're overthinking this and there's other things in those offenses that could potentially offset the limit in targets that they might have to deal with this year as they struggle for fantasy dominance?
I believe I'll start with Jacobs. I fully believe in him. I think they slowly came along with him as the season went on, and he picked up. And I know his receiving total was fairly low last year. He only had 27 targets. But the big thing when he was getting drafted, which put him as the first running back in 2019, was his receiving ability. Everybody just was completely wild about it. And I don't think that's something where he's going to have a lot taken away. I think that's something that can actually improve. I know those other guys are there now, but Derek Carr last year was throwing to essentially nobodies. His best receiver was 160-pound Hunter Renfrow. I believe that offense is going to take leaps and bounds better, which should only help the running back. And even if his receiving total is still as low as it is now, I think he'll more than make up for it with rush attempts, quality attempts in the red zone. I think everything's pointing up for Josh Jacobs. He's a guy who I think we can see skyrocket very soon. As far as Fournette, I think one of two things are going to happen. One, they're either going to try to fade him out of the offense by rotating other guys in, keeping him off the field, or the complete opposite, where they just run him into the ground because they didn't pick up his fifth-year option, and they're going to just get everything they can out of him. And it scares me that it could go either way, and I think that's going to keep him ranked in that range with me, that like 14 to 18 range. Even though I love the player, that situation with whatever's going on with him and that team just isn't working out for me. I don't trust it at all.
Yeah, the connection that Chris Thompson had with the Jaguars, of course, is their offensive coordinator, Jay Gruden, who coached in Washington for 6 years. In his coordinating style, I live here in Washington, D.C., so I hear all the talk on the radio. Jay Gruden, when he was here, the biggest knock on him was that he didn't run the ball enough. He passed it way more than he should have, especially when you got a bad team like the Redskins. You want to try to run the ball and shorten the game a little bit. So the fact that Chris Thompson is now there in Jacksonville, they don't pick up Fournette's fifth-year option. I could see them already kind of fading Fournette out and that offense moving toward a little bit more of a pass, not pass happy, but more pass oriented than it was previous. So that kind of hurts Fournette for me in that sense. And Josh Jacobs, I agree with Ryan. I think Josh Jacobs would be fine. I think the other Gruden likes to lean on the back, the one back. He's kind of an old school in that way. So I think Josh Jacobs will be fine. I think Bowden will be there as sort of a gadget player. He'll probably take a few targets away from Jacobs, not enough to really worry me in fantasy.
I don't know if I necessarily agree that Fournette's going to get that many fewer targets. First and foremost, Chris Thompson has to stay on the field. And second, I would imagine that they would want to run Fournette into the ground, this being his last year of his contract. You obviously need a pass catching back on your team, but I just don't know how much of an impact Chris Thompson will actually have.
Yeah, I guess, Chris Thompson being there, I think it was going to happen anyway, even without Chris Thompson being there. I think that Jay Gruden has always done that, where he's kind of been a little bit more, even when he didn't have a great passer or great receivers, he still kind of passed more than he ran. And I don't see the usage that Fournette had last year being what he has this year. Now, I could be wrong. You could be right that they just run him in the ground.
No. And on that, though, I don't necessarily think, 100 targets is where he's going to be, but 70 plus, sure. 100 targets for him is going to be tough again this year.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that was more of just a product of them having absolutely nobody else outside of DJ Chark. That was the only guy in the offense that was doing anything last year. D.D. Westbrook, we all kind of hyped up to no man's land last season. So, yeah, I think now with just the simple fact that there's other guys that can catch the ball in that offense, we're also hoping for some health potentially from Josh Oliver, who could be a move tight end, who could even be another weapon that they could use in that offense. Yeah, I think targets are going to be removed from Fournette, but not to the extent that people are kind of going with it. I think this is another example of maybe the pendulum swinging just a little bit too far when it comes to, oh well, this guy came in, this is definitely going to happen on this team. I think that we're going to see something that is closer to the medium of those two outcomes happen for Fournette. But I don't know if I agree with you guys with Josh Jacobs. I feel like with Josh Jacobs, everything that you would expect to see from a team that's not planning to use a guy as a receiver has happened in Oakland. Jalen Richard was re-signed. He's not just another guy to take carries away. He's there specifically for targets. And then Lynn Bowden being signed. I mean, if they want to use him at wide receiver, fine, but they've classified him as a running back, so you can expect him to take some of the workload as well. So I wouldn't say that Josh Jacobs is dead or that he's not valuable or that he's not even worth trading for right now just because of his youth, of 3 years left on that contract, and of a lot of rookies that are going to have to kind of battle through their first NFL season minus any training, any offseason program before that. There's a lot of wide receivers that are going to have to learn how to play in the NFL. I don't know if Josh Jacobs has the ceiling that we might have once imagined for him. I think that's been severely hampered by the other guys in that offense. But let's now go on to a guy who, for me, is kind of like a Spider-Man meme. And I think that's what Kyle Shanahan is trying to do with every single target in that offense, almost every running back in that offense as well. If you go back to last year, he was just trying to replicate styles, all three guys that could kind of do both things at wide receiver. Between George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk, I think you have three guys that essentially do the same thing. Obviously, George Kittle's a tight end, so he has the blocking down that those other guys aren't necessarily responsible for to the same extent. But in terms of yak ability, in terms of wide receivers without the most speed but with insane burst, all of these guys kind of fit into the mold of what Shanahan wants in a wide receiver, and probably what is going to be most successful with Jimmy Garoppolo, who is a better intermediate thrower than he is a deep ball thrower. So I think we really need to talk about Deebo Samuel when it comes down to this, because I think George Kittle is the established one in that offense. I think that's pretty clear, unless you guys have an argument to the contrary. But outside of George Kittle, I think that Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel are essentially clones of one another, and that they do exactly the same thing in that offense. I don't know how much oxygen is left after George Kittle gets his piece of the pie that the San Francisco 49ers are actually going to have to dole out to the rest of their receivers. I think another receiver in that offense that is like Deebo is actually very bad for Deebo and can be a situation where both guys kind of stop the other one from really getting towards that ceiling or that higher range of outcomes that a lot of fantasy analysts predicted for Deebo moving forward. How do you guys feel about that situation?
Yeah, as a Niners fan, I'll take this one first, and I agree 100%. I think Deebo and Ayuk are very similar in the sort of the rack yards. Deebo's evolved a little bit in the run game last year on reverses and such, and then of course you got the fact that they're a run first team. They're a run first team, run second team. Sometimes in playoff there we saw they didn't run barely at all, so that also hampers their value as well because there's less targets to go around. You mentioned George Kittle; he's going to be the number one target there. Doesn't leave a whole lot left for two more receivers. I don't see how you're going to have, a viable tight end. You're going to have a viable running back committee. I don't know which one's going to get most of the carries there. And then also have two receivers that can be fancy viable as well. So I think it's going to be like a week-to-week thing where it might be, this is the Ayuk weekend and the next weekend is the Deebo weekend. But as far as putting them in your lineup and knowing which one's going to be which is going to be impossible to really tell.
Yeah, I think we kind of missed that sell high window on Deebo. I really like the player, but I think they're going to kind of cannibalize each other a good bit because they do a lot of similar. I think Deebo's a much better route runner. I think he's an elite route runner, and I think he knows how to get open, so I think that'll keep getting him volume. But Kittle's the number one there no matter what. He's going to be a target monster and all that other – and Ayuk's just going to dig into that. The rest of the guys are going to dig into that. I don't think we're going to see the production we saw this year. And
I don't necessarily know if I agree with that. We won't see the same production because I mean, Emmanuel Sanders was the wide receiver 1 as soon as he came over, right, Jeff?
Yep, he was.
So, and Debo is still pretty valuable. So I have to imagine that Ayuk kind of fills that Sanders role a bit. I mean, Debo and Sanders were somewhat of the same type of player too. So that there wasn't going to be a ton of volume anyway, I don't think, especially because Kittle's there and he will be the target monster. But at the same time, I think Debo could still be a top 24 wide receiver easy this year. I just don't know if his ceiling gets much higher than that.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of saying too. I don't think his ceiling is there. I think they can probably maintain value, but I don't think he's going to be, the number 1 receiver there that you want to go out and try to get. I think he's going to be what he was last year, pretty much.
Consistent. I think he'd be a consistent number 2 for a long time, and that's fine.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to be happy with that. I think drafting Debo in the late first or early second last year anyway. So I think that, just having another guy in that offense probably just makes it a little bit easier for that offense to run. I just don't know what we see in terms of the total pie, like everybody has been alluding to in that offense, because there's so many guys who do the same exact thing. It's just a matter of who Kyle Shanahan schemes up to have the week this particular week. So it's going to be very frustrating choosing who to start week in, week out. Let's now go to every year. There's a team that seemingly comes out of nowhere and is an offensive juggernaut that nobody really saw coming. And for that reason, there's a lot of dynasty value and there's a lot of trade value and there's a lot of fantasy value as a whole on that particular squad because they were underpriced in drafts and find themselves actually producing at crazy levels. There's also the reverse every year. There's always an offense that is hyped up to no end and that everybody thinks is going to be awesome and kind of shows you everything that was wrong with that offense when the season actually rolls around. I think the Cleveland Browns were the prime example of that last year. Is there a team out there that a lot of people who have a lot of faith in that you think might be a dangerous team to heavily invest in the 2020 season, maybe for the reason of somebody that they might have drafted or potentially because of a new coach coming in and kind of changing things, maybe not for the worse, but actually making things a little bit different on the offensive side of the football? Is there a team that is getting a lot of fantasy love out there that you think maybe might not deserve it?
I think I see Carolina being a team like that. Everybody's every year since he's been drafted and been a draft darling has been on Teddy Bridgewater, and he's in a great story. He's kind of battled through everything. He's finally got a starting spot. I believe in Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore, but a lot of the rest of that is going to be a lot of questions. I don't want to see Bridgewater as a heavy volume thrower, and I know they got Robbie Anderson. They got have Curtis Samuel. But Bridgewater's not a guy who's going to be slinging it deep to Robbie Anderson, which I think hurts his value and makes him a little bit overrated. I don't know if Curtis Samuel's ever what we've wanted him to be for the last 2-3 years. And this offense it looks really good on paper, but I don't fully believe in it right now. It scares me in a lot of parts. The line's still not that good. Everyone still believes in Ian Thomas, even though he hasn't really shown anything yet because he's been behind Greg Olsen. I'm not going to have as many pieces other than the top 2 guys on it. I think a lot of people will. I'm not on board with it at all.
So I think the team that I'm going to say here is going to be a little controversial, and let me explain myself before I give you the team name. I think because you're going to be paying such a high premium on every player on this team that where you're going to have to draft them is not going to end up being worth it for you, and that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think that they've been hyped up so much. Tom Brady's there. They're thinking they're getting Tom Brady from 6 years ago. It's going to light it up. Tom Brady is not Jameis Winston. As bad as Winston was with the interceptions, he threw for 5,000 yards, and he was launching it to Mike Evans just relentlessly. And same thing with Godwin, and that's not going to be Tom Brady's game. And I think the price you're paying for those guys, I mean, even people that are buying Gronk, a little bit higher than they probably should be, expecting really big things there. And I think they will be a good offense, but I think the price you're paying for them right now is a little bit too high for me.
That was my first example as well. Tom Brady's not the Tom Brady of 5 years ago. He's the 42-year-old. I guess on the down in the twilight of his career, you can't really trust that Tom Brady is going to help Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Mine is, and I don't know how controversial this is because I just don't know how people feel about them, but the Green Bay Packers. I mean, we already know the controversy surrounding them in the NFL draft, not taking any wide receivers, taking 3 straight backups to start the draft. And so they didn't really get any pass catchers. I mean, you have Adams, and then who else is catching the ball there that you trust? Nobody really. They have Jay Sternberger, who is stepping into his second season, didn't play much last year. The other wide receivers on that team, there's just nothing exciting about them whatsoever. So, and Aaron Rodgers has placed lower and lower in terms of fantasy in each of the past 3 seasons. He's 36 years old, going on 37. So not like crazy old, but he's getting to a point where his skills are diminishing and he doesn't have any pass catchers that he can trust to throw it up to, except for Adams. And then you add A.J. Dillon as well to that backfield. So Jamal Williams, while I thought was valuable before A.J. Dillon because he was always going to get snaps and he was getting taken way late, now he has competition. Aaron Jones had 19 total touchdowns last season on a relatively few attempts in terms of targets and runs, but or carries, sorry. And so I think that he's going to see some touchdown regression. And I mean, Rodgers, though not going high, he's QB 13 right now in startups. There's a lot of guys behind him I would rather have. Devontae Adams is really the only one that is deserving of where he's going. He's going as a wide receiver 3. He's going to get like 200 targets this season. I think I said that on your guys' show.
Yep.
Yeah.
But even like Aaron Jones is going at RB12. And I just don't know if he's going to get the yardage necessary to finish there. I mean, Leonard Fournette's right behind him. Austin Eckler's behind him. Swift, Kenyon Drake, J.K. Dobbins. There's guys behind him I would much rather have because I think they'll have either have a better 2020 or they just have a brighter future. So the Packers are turning, and they even came out and said they're turning into a more run-heavy team. So I can't imagine they're going to score a lot. They're going to win with running the ball or try to win with running the ball in defense. So I just don't think I want to invest in anybody there.
Yeah, I can see where all those teams are coming from. I would just say, in terms of Aaron Jones, wouldn't the reverse of that, though, being, well, if you're the Green Bay Packers and you don't have any wide receivers and one wide receiver is going to get all these targets, I mean, you would think that at least a few targets have to go elsewhere on that team. And there, like you said, there really isn't any other target. So
did they, though, last year?
Aaron Jones. They did.
No, they did not.
At least in the games that Devontae Adams was either coming back.
Aaron Jones in 16 games last season had 62 targets.
Yes, in the games that Devontae Adams –
or 68 targets, sorry.
In the games that Devontae Adams were inactive, he was much more heavily used in the passing game.
Well, is Devontae Adams inactive?
I'm just saying.
If
there's nobody else on that team, then you would think –
there was nobody else on the team last year, Eitan.
There were multiple guys that were trying to work in the offense last year. There was
It didn't work.
Tried last year. There was MPS that they tried last year. There was Lazard that they tried last year. There was a bunch of guys.
Had his flashes, but nobody else caught the ball.
Stop you forgetting one very important guy, Jimmy Graham. He got
did he slowly have or did he below the radar have another 90 target season? We just didn't know about it.
No, he had 60 targets. He was the third leading receiver on that team, though.
Jesus Christ. See? They're not, but the other thing, Eitan, for me is that Jamal Williams, like Ryan brought up, gets a significant amount of snaps on passing downs because of his superior pass blocking. He had 45 targets last season to Aaron Jones' 68, despite playing a lot fewer snaps, especially towards the end of the season. So I think that 70 target threshold is probably where you're going to see Aaron Jones reside, which is not bad by any means.
Oh, yeah.
But he's not getting the carries, and I think the touchdown regression hits him enough where it's like he's definitely not worth his draft capital.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a situation where he'll have to be efficient again to be able to maintain it. But I mean, you also like heavily invest in guys that were super efficient to and expect them to do that again in guys like Austin Eckler. I think that you have to, if you're going to, on one hand, believe in one guy that has to be efficient to get what he needs to get done. I think it's the same thing in the same type of offense in Green Bay for Aaron Jones. So I would say that, if anything, commitment to more running just means a bigger pie for all of the running backs and just more touches somehow for Aaron Jones. But that might be a pie in the sky. That said, I do think that there's one guy out there that maybe people aren't necessarily thinking about because of the presence of another guy in their offense, at least not this year, but I think it could happen this year. And I think if you look at all the running backs drafted, even with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, even with Swift, even with Jonathan Taylor, I think J.K. Dobbins actually is the one with true RB1 potential because of the offense he finds himself in. Yes, Mark Ingram is there for the year. I think he completely takes everything from Gus Edwards, who's quietly had like 700 yards a season over the last couple of seasons. So I think that's a given for Dobbins if he's healthy. But if Mark Ingram were to go down, if a Kareem Hunt situation happens to open up for J.K. Dobbins in the Ravens offense on a team that is going to lead the league in rushing and in rushing efficiency, I don't see how you cannot be really excited about J.K. Dobbins as a potential RB1, not an RB1, but the RB1 in the next couple of seasons. Do you guys have that kind of faith in J.K. Dobbins and the Baltimore offense, or are you guys a little bit more tempered in your expectations when it comes to him?
I'll take this. I'm being a Ravens fan, and it's kind of hitting home for me. I fully believe in him. I wasn't full on with a running back before the draft because I didn't think that was the biggest need. But when it was going on, Dobbins is the one I wanted because I think he gives a dynamic piece of that offense that doesn't have. Yes, we saw Mark Ingram do really well. We saw Gus Edwards, who is just a dude. He's just a north-south runner who's big, average 5 yards a clip on his carries. And none of them have the explosion Dobbins has. Dobbins has that 0 to 60 where he's full speed and gone. He's elusive in space. He's a fantastic receiver out of the backfield. And we saw him do really well at Ohio State. But his last year there, where he hit 2,000 yards, was with a quarterback, I'm going to use this very loosely, but with a similar skill set with Justin Fields, where they ran that zone read option, where it was just dynamic and they couldn't stop him. He's the perfect fit to go with Jackson. If he gets the opportunity, it's his. Like, he's not giving it up. I think he's a star there, and it adds a different element of fear. And I think it'll take some of the rushing attempts away from Lamar because he brings that kind of electric ability as well. I think you may have to temper your expectations year one, which could give you to a potential buying window of fantasy. But year two, I think he has RB1 potential completely. Because like you said, Ingram's contract can be done after this year with no salary cap repercussions. Gus Edwards' salaries, he's a free agent after this year, which would leave Dobbins in Justice Hill, and which means that backfield is Dobbins. And he can be absolutely, I think he can be an RB1 there.
Yeah, when you said the RB1, I don't know if I see that. I do see him being a top probably top six guy. And the reason is because of the receiving there. The Ravens' leading running back receiver last year was just Mark Ingram. He had 26 catches. So they don't pass the ball to the running back a lot.
That was 12% last year.
What was it, Ryan?
12% of the running back position last year, which was
12%.
like bottom 3 in the league, or bottom
Yeah,
5
so
in the league.
that's the one thing holding back Dobbins from being like the RB1 for me. With that said, though, like Ryan mentioned, Ingram's contract after this year is pretty much something they can just walk away from, and it'll be Dobbins' backfield to himself, basically. And I do think that at some point they're going to have a Ingram and Dobbins sort of rotating in there pretty regularly. And I think Dobbins does have value this year, but next year his value is going to skyrocket.
Yeah, I mean, the Baltimore Ravens had 4.73 adjusted line yards last year. That was the third best run blocking line. And it's not just that. I mean, everybody knows that an athletic quarterback, a quarterback that can make people miss, like Lamar Jackson, just makes it all that much easier for running backs to be able to be effective in that offense. And that is a big reason why Baltimore also had one of the most efficient rushing attempts. I do get what everyone's saying about them not necessarily using their running backs in the passing game all that often, but they don't really use the passing game as a whole all that often because they're so efficient at running the football. I think there's enough room for multiple guys to be very viable in that offense. And in the event that anything happens to Ingram for just a couple of games, then I think what Ryan was saying about J.K. Dobbins not giving up that role stands, even if that happens this year. So in that situation, with that type of talent around him, and with the lack of true investment that they made at the wide receiver position, outside of the guys that they brought in last year, they didn't really kind of go back to the well in the first couple of rounds this year. Again, looking to add to that, and they already have tight ends on their team that they're going to pass to. I think that we just see more and more shift towards the talented few that they do have in their backfield. So I can see that for Dobbins, again, sooner rather than later. But now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, of every episode of the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast, and that is the diagnostic itself. We're going to plug in the analyzer and get to this week's Dynasty Diagnostic. And our episode 70 roster was submitted by Dustin Church. You can find him at Dynasty Junkie FF. Please be sure to give him a follow. If you want to be part of next week's show, follow the podcast, smash that subscribe button, and leave a review on iTunes. So it is a 12-team Superflex, 1 point per reception, 1.5 point tight end premium, 0.25 points per carry, 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end, 4 flex, and 1 Superflex roster. At quarterback in a Superflex league, we're rolling out Drew Lock, Dwayne Haskins, and Derek Carr. This seems to be kind of one of those situations where you could go either way with this. If you really have faith in Drew Lock, then you have some upside there. Haskins can't necessarily be worse than he was last year, so you have at least a viable second quarterback there. And Derek Carr could be a lot better than he was last year with at least some weapons in his offense this year, even if he's not necessarily the guy you're looking to for upside on the team. So I don't know if I'm really heavily investing at the quarterback position with this team, knowing some of the other holes that I have to fill. Do you guys feel the same way, or do you think that we need to maybe pump the brakes on Drew Lock a bit and then make it a lot more of a worrisome situation when you look at the quarterback quality that this guy has on his team?
I'm thinking that was the first thing that stood out to me was the quarterbacks here in Superflex League, 12 teams, was the quarterbacks a little bit suspect. Drew Lock is a upside guy, but he's not going to be consistent. Then you got, who is it? Derek Carr, he's meh. And then what was the other? Dwayne Haskins. Yeah, so there a lot of upside guys there that could pan out, and they could also flop. So I see he's got the 106. Obviously, you're not going to get Tua. You're not going to get Burrow. There's a chance that you might get Herbert at the 106, depending on what the teams in the middle there need. So that's who I think I would be targeting to hopefully improve my quarterback. So that's a big hole, I think, there in this team.
Yeah, I like Drew Lock. I think the upside's there. We actually talked about this at length with Stompy when he was on the show on Tuesday. He has a ton of upside. The weapons are there. That team obviously is building around him, and it gives you a great upside pick. Derek Carr terrifies me. We don't even know if he's going to start over Mariota this year. They're kind of the same blah kind of player. And then Haskins a starter, so I guess you just start him and be okay with it. They didn't build around Haskins, which isn't great. So I don't know how much of a jump we'll see in his production. I wouldn't know if I'd do 1.6 for Herbert because in Superflex, you're going to see really good running back there, which is another need fall. But he does have the 108, which I think could be another place where you get Herbert as well, or help that quarterback position.
So if you actually look at this roster like further down, you'll see that it's definitely a rebuild. He has 2 firsts and 6 seconds in 2020, and he has 3 firsts and 9 seconds in 2021. So definitely a rebuild.
Yeah, he owns the entire second round.
Right. So I guess here's the question is, how do we feel about the 2021 class, especially in terms of running backs? I know personally, it's going to be top heavy and not very deep. So you have Chuba Hubbard, you have Najee Harris, and you have Travis Etienne next year. I'm sure there are others, but those are kind of the 3 top guys. And if you're going to skip running back here, in 2020, you better hope to God that you get one of those first like 3 or 4 picks, maybe even 2 of them in 2021. So you can have those running backs as soon as next year, because you're definitely not going to compete this year, I don't believe. Now in this class, 1.06, you might be able to get Dobbins, you might be able to get Swift, you might be able to get Akers. And then 1.08, I've seen guys go as late as like 110 in terms of those top 4 or 5 running backs. So it really depends on how we feel about those 2 classes. I've already said my spiel about Drew Lock. I think with how the draft went and what they did this offseason, I think Drew Lock will be a top 10 quarterback this season. But I understand why you can't rely on him, and there's not really anybody you can rely on this roster. That being said, I don't know if there's anybody you can pick in 2020 that's you're going to be relying upon, but again, you aren't competing. So I would probably try and pick 2 running backs in 2020, and then in 2021, hope I get one of Trevor Lawrence or JT.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing for me. With the roster, the way it is right now, I think that it would be a mistake to heavily invest at the quarterback position, because you're going to have to spend something that you don't have. You're going to have to put assets together to get a quarterback on this team, and that's not what you want to do in a rebuild that at least is kind of drawn out as much as backs is probably the way to go. However, for me on this team, I don't necessarily see a direct pathway to competing. If I'm drafting a running back on a dynasty roster, for me, in a rookie draft on a team that's in a rebuild, I'm a little bit nervous, because then it puts a timer on everything else. And you have a solid 2 to 4 years really left to truly compete with those running backs, to getting those rookie running backs on my team. And while I do know that next year is top heavy, if the roster is kind of what we think the roster is right now, then I think you might be in a good shot to land a quarterback and 1 or 2 of those running backs going into next year. We also should probably assume that somebody is going to emerge. Another 1 or 2 guys are going to emerge in the running back room, and maybe one of the 3 guys is probably going to drop off. So we might see a little bit more volume in terms of the guys at the top next year looking at running back. But yeah, I'd just be wary of heavily investing in that right now with my team is currently constructed, because there are so many other holes left to fill. Now we're going to move on to the wide receiver, and this is kind of going to go directly to what I was talking about before. On this team, you have A.J. Brown at wide receiver. Outside of that, I don't see much else, and we've already talked about the needs that you have both at quarterback and at running back with this group. So I'm of the opinion that right now, with the amount of fervor around A.J. Brown, I'm looking at that as a guy that is probably your most expendable piece, because he's going to be the most valuable piece in someone that you can get multiple assets back for. You could probably ask for a couple of high firsts for AJ Brown, and that would probably help a lot. That would make going with running back in this draft, given what you have with the 106 and 108 to go after wide receiver, a little bit more viable for you. If you want to do it that way, maybe just rely on one for that 3 to 4 year window that I just talked about. But yeah, I think that this is a situation that with Miles Boykin, AJ Brown, Alan Hearns, Andy Isabella, Richie James, Alshon Jeffrey, Marvin Jones, and Kenny Stills, that you're going to need to tear it down before you build it up. I think anybody that has the value that AJ Brown has right now doesn't necessarily belong on this team, because you want to, number one, be in line to be a high drafter next year. Number two, I think you can instead exchange a guy like AJ for a lot of volume at the position and maybe come out with 3 of the top rookies in this class at wide receiver. Next year, you'll also have a pretty decent wide receiver class as well. So you can do the same thing with those 3 first-round picks. How do you guys feel about the way that I dealt with that? I know AJ Brown is young himself, and for that reason, a lot of guys are kind of going to build around him. But do you guys kind of take the way of keeping that talent on your team, or using this as an opportunity just to collect as many assets as possible and try to rebuild in one go in these next couple of drafts?
I vehemently disagreed. I'll let Ryan go. I'm just going to say I vehemently disagree with you.
You go first, man. You already started. You seem like you're on a roll.
I apologize. This is one I had to jump in first because I do not agree with my co-host here at all. And the reason is, if you're in a rebuild, you want to get young wide receivers and you want to get draft picks. You don't really want to get those rookie running backs until you are ready everywhere else. He already has a ton of assets in 2020 and 2021. He has 5 firsts, 15 seconds total, multiple thirds as well in both years. So I'd rather keep AJ Brown because AJ Brown's going to be around for 10 plus years. So it's not like you have to get rid of him because you're not ready to compete in 2 or 3 years. I mean, it'll be tough for him to meet his efficiency that he did last year, but he's developed, or he's become the wide receiver 1 for Tennessee, and he's extremely young. So that is almost the exact opposite thing I would be doing for a rebuild team. I think you need to keep, in terms of these wide receivers, you need to keep AJ Brown. You should keep Andy Isabella, and you should keep Miles Boykin. Everybody else should be sold, in my opinion. Kenny Stills, Marvin Jones, Alshon Jeffrey.
My argument for AJ Brown isn't that AJ Brown isn't exactly what you're looking for in a rebuild. It's that it's one piece of a lot of pieces that you need to work on in a rebuild. I'm not even necessarily.
I understand that, but
I'm not even necessarily taking just picks when I'm looking for dealing a guy like AJ Brown. I think
I understand
young receiver and picks back. I just think that what AJ allows you to do right now is you use the amount of people that are behind him taking that next step, and you use all of that hype around him. Not saying he can't necessarily reach there, but to get as many assets as you possibly can in an attempt to rebuild multiple things at once. I think if you're keeping AJ Brown here, then yes, 106 or 108, they're not necessarily going to get you a quarterback. You might find yourself in the same position next year. If you're selling AJ Brown, you're probably getting like 102, 103, and another asset. So you can get a quarterback and then something else along with him. So for me, that is a quicker way to a rebuild than trying to just make sure that you get everything else right.
I would family tiff time going for 2. Sorry.
It's fine.
I would understand that if he was the only piece on this team. He's not the only piece this team has. Like I said, 5 firsts over the next 2 seasons, 15 seconds. He has pieces to already rebuild. And AJ Brown has already proven himself. He was a wide receiver 2 last season on very low volume, pretty efficient. He's already proven himself in the NFL. You can't guarantee me that CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, as much as we like them as prospects, will actually do something. So, I mean, you at the very least are building around AJ Brown and Drew Lock here, where if you get rid of AJ Brown, you may not have any wide receivers over the next 2 or 3 seasons because none of them pan out. So it's more of a risk reward balance. And I think it's a bigger risk to trade AJ Brown for unknown assets than it would be to keep AJ Brown, who is a known asset at this point. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of risk involved because of how much volume he was given last year, but he's still a much more well-known commodity than, say, like I said, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, Justin Jefferson. So that's why I say keep AJ Brown. You already have the assets below. You already have guys you should be able to sell: Marvin Jones, Alshon Jeffrey, Kenny Stills. Those guys, I think you can sell for. I mean, it might not be a lot, but you could probably get a second rounder for Kenny Stills, maybe a couple thirds for Marvin Jones and Alshon Jeffrey.
So with this team, if you got Cortland Sutton in the 103, you're keeping AJ Brown in
for AJ Brown. You're not getting that for AJ Brown.
I'm telling you, man, that's good. You're getting those types of deals.
Bullshit. Prove it. I'm calling prove it right now because I'm calling bullshit on that trade. Nobody is making. You've called me out on some trades. That trade's atrocious. And guess what? I've had a trade where somebody said Kenyon Drake is worth a 2021 first and Austin Eckler, and I laughed in his face. And that was that type of trade, Aton.
There's no way. A lot of people are down on Sutton because of the other targets in that offense. I'm just saying there's
who is down on Sutton? I think you just say shit anecdotally that has no basis in fact. You just make shit up as you go, don't you? God damn it, Aton.
It's clearly
Get
not
your
the
popcorn,
case.
ladies and gentlemen.
It's clearly not the case. Obviously, we have our disagreements there. Let's kind of present this to our guests here. Again, you're faced with the decision of taking an asset like an AJ Brown and trying to build around him with what you've got, or taking an asset like AJ Brown, squeezing the most you can out of him, potentially getting a young piece, and then another asset that you can then build with. With this type of roster where you have so many holes to fill, what is your inclination? And we'll start with you, Jeff.
All right, so in the first part there with the quarterbacks, I mentioned that I'd probably look at taking Herbert at the 106. He also has the 108. So I'm looking long term. Like, I don't think you're going to compete this year, obviously. You're probably not going to compete again next year. And probably not even year 3. You have a team full of rookies now that probably you're not going to be competing there either. So if you draft running back with the 6 or the 8, by the time you can actually compete and use them, they're going into year 4, their last year of the contract. So I'm looking long term, which is why I said I would go quarterback at the 106, and I'd probably get a receiver at the 108. And going back to your AJ Brown question, I think I would also hold on to AJ Brown. Now, if this team didn't have as many picks as it already has, he'd be the one I'd want to sell to get those picks. But with, like he said, he's got 6 or 5 firsts over the next 2 years, and like something like crazy, like 16 or 15 seconds. I think he's already got the draft picks that he would get for AJ Brown. And I would think I would hold AJ Brown because he's still going to be good 3 or 4 years from now when you're finally ready to compete and have that team that you built over the last couple of years.
What about you, Ryan?
I think you can trade AJ Brown for a lot, man. There were some bidding wars in my league recently. I was trying to find while Jeff was talking, but dude, he's a stud, but right now his trade value is outlandish, and I think his value is really, really high right now. I offered this was before the draft. I offered Gallup and a first, and it was declined immediately for him. And I think you can get a solid wide receiver too, who's young with upside, plus draft picks for it. He's a super talented player, but he's not somebody who's completely irreplaceable. And I think with the picks you have, and if you time the trades right on this team, you can make this team a contender quicker than we think. Because you have a lot, like some of these older guys that hold on now and wait to move during the season. Like Marvin Jones, Alshon Jeffrey, Kenny Stills, who we all mentioned, are definitely trades and guys you want to get rid of. Same with Rashad Penny, who's not starter now, but could be at a time when there's injuries occur. There's going to be sell windows for those guys in the season. This is a team you have to be patient with. And I'd move around in the drafts with this team, move back a lot. Or if I want a guy, go get him because you have the draft capital to do it. But if you can get a huge offer for AJ Brown, I wouldn't mind dangling him out there. I'm not taking anything where there's any chance I'm going to regret it. It could be a trade where people may complain, but I think you can, if you trace him out to the entire league, I think you can find somebody who would buy him for the right price.
I think it would really depend on the offer that I got because, I think A.J. Brown is a proven commodity. Now, if I got, like that, like you said earlier, Cortland Sutton in the 103, I'm probably taking that because Cortland Sutton's also young, also established, and I'm getting the 103 on top of that. I just don't think you can get that much for him. A.J. Brown, to me, like I said, he's a young receiver. He's going to be good for years and years. So you got him on your team already. You've already got a gazillion draft picks already. I think I'm just going to sit on him and just, kind of reap the benefits from his ability.
All right, so at tight end, we have Jack Doyle, who is the MVP in Stompy's mind. We have Red Ellison, Josh Oliver, Jordan Reed, Jonnu Smith, Jordan Thomas, Jason Witten. And again, we've said many times, this is a real rebuilding roster. So on this rebuilding roster of sorts, are you looking for a tight end like Dallas Goedert, like Evan Ingram to potentially bring to this team? Are you looking for somebody who still hasn't necessarily broken out yet, but people think has the ability to, like TJ Hawkinson? Or are you content with what you have at tight end and just looking in to bring in any guys that are undrafted potentially in your rookie drafts and slowly grow at that position? Are you going out for a specific piece there?
I don't know why there's so many tight ends on this roster. Like, there's a lot that
Premium.
I know it's a premium, but
that's the only reason. That's the only thing I got. That's why people like hoard QBs.
That's fine.
But, I mean, when you're hoarding these nothing tight ends, maybe not the best option.
Right. If you're hoarding talent, yes. Like, I'm cool with Jonnu and Jordan. I'm cool with Johnny on my team. All the rest are expendable dudes to me. If I can get anything for them, I'm moving them. Maybe Jack Doyle during the season, but these other guys, if I get a third or fourth for them, I'm doing it because there's nobody there I really, really want. I mean, Jordan Reed is he still going to be back this year?
I don't know.
I think he actually has no feet.
Right, like I'd move him for anything I could.
It's also had about 17 concussions.
Get those third, fourth round picks for him that you can use the sweeten deals to move this team up and upgrade and get whatever you can. Like I said, other than Jonnu, I'm kind of out on everybody else tight end wise.
So are you punting on the position as a whole just until this team starts to develop a little bit, or are you looking for a specific guy or a specific tier of guy right now, just looking to kind of backfill this roster?
I think with the tight end position, like right now, I'd stay building quarterback, running back, receiver. Tight end I'd hold off on just for the fact tight ends hitting is so random, it seems like recently, that I would just get late round picks, young tight ends, free agent, young guys who are just out there and hope one hits. And then once this roster's built up and on the verge of contending, then I think I'd make the move for a tight end unless something hits before that. But I think you can strike gold at the tight end position if you know where to look.
The only way I would invest in tight end here is if you can somehow buy one low. But with it being tight end premium, I doubt that you can be able to buy anybody low. You can get something like OJ Howard, maybe you could buy him low potentially. Maybe you get like the rookies from last year that weren't very good, like Noah Fant, who had an okay season, had a couple big games here and there, but nothing great. Hawkinson, the same thing. Maybe you can buy one of those guys low, but other than that, I don't think I'm looking at tight end right now. I think I'm just gonna punt the position, like you said. Maybe I pick one up in the draft this year, super late. I don't know if this is like a 3-round or a 4-round or a 5-round draft here that we got, but there's some guys you can probably get in the 4th or 5th round, or even after the draft is done and get them undrafted. A guy like Thaddeus Moss, for example, you can probably get him super late if not just after the draft completely. And he has a starting position here in Washington, so I think he could be someone that you could plug in there and get you 3 catches for 25 yards or something a game. So that's how I would look at this roster here with the tight ends.
Or take one in 2021 when you have 12 picks in the first 2 rounds.
Yeah. I mean, wow, you could take one. I mean, That's the thing is you could take a few tight ends in the seconds here because 15 goddamn second round picks. And you could probably potentially get another second rounder with like Jack Doyle. I mean, again, you're not competing this year. You have Jonnu, who I like, Josh Oliver, who I liked last year. And if he stays healthy this year, Eifert sure as hell's not going to stay healthy. And he could get an opportunity. Everybody else, I mean, Jason Witten might have some. With the premium, it looks like he's actually pretty good in this league. So you could sell him for maybe a third round pick, maybe Jack Doyle for a second, just get more draft capital at this point. Because there's not really any point in you having this many tight ends.
Agreed.
And talking about unrealistic trade scenarios, Jack Doyle for a second.
Jesus, it's tight end premium.
Tight end premium league. I'm just gonna say, if you're gonna call me up for unrealistic trade
How is that
scenarios,
not realistic to you?
I don't know who's giving you a second round pick in any type of tight end premium.
If they are in a win now situation where they could use a backup tight end or a tight end at all, and a 2021 second presents itself, you don't think somebody is going to trade a 2021 second for Jack Doyle?
I think
And you could sell Rivers. I mean, Rivers to a tight end has been a thing for his entire career.
Yeah. I've already tried to sell.
Rivers
Hey, Pon, I have already tried to sell you on this garbage, and you won't listen.
Because it's garbage. I'm sorry.
It's not garbage.
Oh man,
Jesus.
Second round pick for Jack Doyle. I love it. But that is going to be the end of our diagnosing this roster. This is definitely a rebuild. There's a lot of scenarios that you can kind of play this out in your head. You do certainly have the draft picks to make yourself a contender fairly soon. We would just say that I think consensus is you're keeping Drew Lock no matter what. What you want to do with A.J. Brown is up to you. There's definitely arguments for both sides there. But outside of there, you need help everywhere. I just think you should take your time in building this roster, build out those wide receivers, get yourself a second solid quarterback, maybe grab a tight end or two, and then spend an entire draft class on the running back position and get yourself 2 to 4 guys to really bolster that out in one at the time that the rest of your team is kind of stocked enough up to be able to compete. And then you're looking at a decent team here. But this is the diagnostic. This is the service center. Every week we asked our guests to go ahead, look at this roster, and give us some kind of card jargon as to what this roster should be to you. We're expert mechanics here. Everybody who's ever listened to the show knows this. Me and Stompy definitely know what we're talking about when it comes to cards. But I wanted to ask you, both Ryan and Jeff, what is this team to you in terms of card terms?
For me, it's totaled. Get a brand new car. Use all those draft picks and get you a brand new car. It's finished. You know, I think you got a couple pieces you can move, you can hang on to, but for the most part, this roster just needs to be flipped completely over.
I'm not going to go full on totaled. I'm going to go maybe you've been in a bad wreck and need your radiator fixed, you need a bumper, fender, bunch of work done to it. But the insides are okay. You have the draft picks to do well, and you have 2 players to go from there. But it's not completely done, but I think it's going to be very expensive.
So I'm watching New Girl again right now, and Winston.
Love that show.
Winston has the most beat up car that could be running possible.
What's his car's name?
I don't know. What is it?
I can't remember. That's why I asked you.
I think he changed it multiple times because like it's like a Ford Explorer, but it's just a pile of garbage. But anyway, like his bumpers are tied on with like rope and straps, and everything's broken. It's dirty. It's got rust spots. It's this like you can have a literal functioning team here with everybody. But it's a pile of garbage, and at some point, if like just one thing goes wrong, this entire roster crumbles. But luckily, you've done enough, and you've saved up your money, and you're going to be able to put in a substantial down payment over the next 2 years on a new roster.
Yeah. This is one of those scenarios where, I mean, you break, you get into like a fender bender, you break your bumper, maybe a window gets shot out, and instead of the insurance company paying for the damage, they just tell you that the window and the bumper total cost to be replaced is more than the car, and the thing is total as is. So that's kind of where you're at with the current roster. But as everyone said, you definitely have everything that you need in the bank already to go ahead and get this redone in a way. I just tend to find some I guess some hesitancy to totally try to rebuild in a draft class or even two draft classes really quickly because, as you know, these rookies can go either way. I mean, that first round pick is worth the value of a first as long as it's a first round pick. As soon as that's converted into a player, if that's a wide receiver that doesn't necessarily hit, if that's JJ Arcega-Whiteside, for example, who was drafted in the late first in some in a lot of leagues last year, then you've kind of let the bottom fall out there. So I'm looking at even using some of these picks potentially for buying young veterans. I'd look at a lot of those seconds for Deontay Johnson this year. I would look at maybe some of those late firsts for Marquise Brown that we've talked about before on this podcast. There's a lot of guys that you can get that do have some proven ability to them as well that are going to make those picks a little less risky for you when you try to rebuild this roster as it is currently constructed. But thank you for sending it in. It was a blast to take apart. And that is going to take us to the end of our show. So, guys, before we return the keys, I just want to shift this completely over to you guys from Going for Two. Tell us who you are. Tell us where to find you. Tell us what you've got going on for the rest of this year so far. And hopefully we have a season to actually talk about moving forward in these next couple of months.
All right, yeah, so you can follow me at Jeff Lambert77 on Twitter. That's Jeff spelled Geoff. Of course, our podcast is live every Tuesday night. It's called the Armchair Fantasy Show. You can either search for that or search for Going for Two. Either one will come up. We're live on Facebook Live, Periscope, and YouTube. So you can find us in all those spots there. And then we have a great month of guests coming up. We're actually booked on the show through June. Some great guests. We just had Stompy on last week. We had Aton on for the draft show. So some great guests. So just definitely check us out every Tuesday night. Like I said, YouTube, Facebook Live, and Periscope.
Yeah, and you can find me at Ryan Searfoss at Fantasy FB Connect. And like you said, the Armchair Fantasy Show. I'll also be putting out the Going for Two War Room episodes here, started probably next week. They're going to be quick 5-10 minute shows, kind of just recapping the draft and new roster moves for fantasy. And then you can find me at the Dynasty Draft Room as well. I cover the SEC there, and we have a draft guide that came out that's definitely worth checking out.
All right, guys, that is going to be it today. Please make sure to follow your head technicians. You can find me on Twitter at AtonAlive. You can find Sam on Twitter at FFStompy. Please go to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast feed on iTunes. Give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps the podcast grow and reach more listeners. We also have a Patreon. We have some cool goodies for those that do support the pod. You can also go to our store, envy.com, FF Pod Shirts store. That's Dynasty Outhouse store. You can get our merchandise as well as merchandise from all of your favorite podcasts on that store. And 10% of every sale goes directly to Scott Fish's charity. And thank you for making it to the Dynasty Diagnostic Service Center today. Please be sure to keep up with your scheduled maintenance and catch us next time to ensure quality performance. See you guys on your next visit.